Doctor Who, The New Adventures Books Review. Hello and welcome to another video. Now this week I wanted to do a video about the book series The New Adventures, which were published by Virgin Publishing and ran for 6 years from 1991 to 1997. They purported to be a continuation of the original series, carrying on the adventures of the Seventh Doctor and Ace after the end of Survival in 1989. At the time, they were very much posited as being the official continuation of the programme, though their canonical status has become rather more dubious over the last 10 to 15 years, both with the advent of New Who and with a number of different versions of the Seventh Doctor and Ace's future adventures in both Big Finish and various other media. But what were they like? Were they any good? Are they still any good? Now, I was a big supporter of the New Adventures at the time, certainly to begin with, and I do still have a complete collection of all of them, though to be honest I've only read one of them in about the last 10 to 15 years. So some of these I may or may not remember as much as some others. Now, the first book in the series was Time Worm Genesis, written by John Peel, who wrote a number of novelizations of Dalek stories from the TV show. This was published in June 1991. Now, the thing about Genesis is I actually remember I read this for the very first time a month later, because I deliberately saved it up. I actually read this in July, late July, on the plane as I was emigrating to Australia. That's right. That's probably my overriding memory of Genesis. Now, the book itself is okay. It kicks off a four volume arc called, with the banner title of Time Worm, which is about this creature that becomes some other creature with time travel abilities, and it's a bit convoluted. Genesis itself is basically a fun adventure story. It's not going to frighten the horses. At the time there was some sort of kerfuffle in the newspapers, I think, about a nudity or something, or paedophilia or something ridiculous, because I seem to remember there's like a couple of references to the fact that like 13-year-olds were basically seen as adults in that society. I mean, it's a Doctor Who book, for fuck's sake. It's not like you get any, it's not like anything happens. It's just a reference. Characterization is good. The Seventh Doctor and Ace both seem like themselves, and generally speaking, it starts off the book series pretty well. Now, the next book in the series was Time Worm Exodus, which was written by veteran Who novelization writer and script writer and script editor, the legendary Terrance Dicks. And as you would expect, Exodus is pretty top stuff. It's basically, the plot is fairly cliched on the surface. The Doctor and Ace arrive in Britain in the early 1950s and find it very different to how it should be, because the Nazis won World War II, and the Doctor has to extricate themselves from that situation and then travel back in time and figure out exactly what went wrong. Despite the Time Worm's presence in this book, the Time Worm is not responsible for the time change. It's actually a rather different old enemy from a certain Patrick Troughton story. I won't give the game away completely if you haven't read it. But generally speaking, this is a really good book. It's very readable, very entertaining, very Doctor Who. The next book in the series was Time Worm Apocalypse, written by Nigel Robinson, who I think was once editor of the Target book novelization range. Now, I remember very little about Apocalypse, to be honest with you. What the plot was, there's some kind of happy society on an alien world that's hiding a dark secret or something. I mean, the nicest thing you can say is that It's fairly bog standard traditional Doctor Who. There's nothing to frighten the horses. It's just not. I remember very little about it because it wasn't very memorable. Now, the next book in the series, the final in the initial Time Worm run, was Revelation, written by a name familiar to fans nowadays, Paul Cornell. This was actually his debut as a writer, a published writer, and it's the climax to the series, and it's pretty darn good. I absolutely loved Revelation at the time. I still think it's a very good book. It's very surreal. It's very weird. It's extremely well written. It's a really, really good book, and it's probably the first of the 4 books that really does kind of do what the back cover blurb says, stories that are too broad and too deep for the small screen. This is really the first that really does that while still feeling like Doctor Who. Honestly, Cornell, although my opinion of him these days is less than favourable, he was my favourite New Adventures writer back in the day, and this is probably my favourite of his books. Now, that initial quartet of books were such a success that the series kept going. Now, they made the decision to do another series of linked books, which was probably a mistake. It's the Cat's Cradle trilogy, which is based around the fairly tenuous link that there's something wrong with the TARDIS. It really only has an impact on the first book, and the other 2 you can clearly see that the writers don't really care and just want to write their own stories. Now, the first book in this trilogy is Time's Crucible, written by Mark Platt, who of course wrote Ghostlight on television. So I was rather looking forward to this because I loved Ghostlight. Unfortunately, this was the first book in the series that just left me kind of staring at the book going, what the hell was all that about? And even after all this time, your guess is as good as mine. The TARDIS, I don't know, it gets destroyed, or sort of it turned inside out into some sort of weird endless city with impossible dimensions or something. Honestly, I found this book a real slog to get through, impenetrable and fairly incomprehensible, which is something that unfortunately would become a common refrain with the New Adventures, where I'm halfway through it, I don't know what it's about, and I get to the end and I still don't know what the hell that was all about. This doesn't feel like Doctor Who, and in a bad way. Yeah, I was not a fan. The next book is Warhead, written by McCoy-era script editor Andrew Cartmel. Now, this is it's a big improvement on the previous book. As with the previous book, this really doesn't feel anything like Doctor Who. It's a sort of cyberpunk, futuristic, dystopian thing. It's not very Doctor Who at all, the storytelling style, but it's a pretty good book. It's very well written. It's a pretty solid sci-fi thriller. So I don't mind Warhead. I don't mind the overall trilogy, not the Cat's Cradle trilogy, the War trilogy that Cartmel weaves in and out of the whole range. This isn't my favourite, but it's a good read. The next book, and the final in the Cat's Cradle trilogy, is Witchmark by new writer Andrew Hunt, who has never been heard of since. Now, this, unlike the previous few, this is very much kind of traditional Doctor Who, even with kind of like magic and magical creatures and that. There's a sci-fi rationale for it, and it feels like a very traditional Doctor Who story. That's the good thing. The bad thing is it's not very good. I mean, after the previous few stories, it's probably came something of a relief to readers at the time, because it's much more recognisably Doctor Who, but it's just not that compelling or interesting. Oh well. Now, after this, they started doing standalone books. There are still a few arcs to come, but they kind of drop the banner titles from this point on and just give them individual titles. The next book in the series is Nightshade. which is written by none other than Mark Gatiss, who has become a very famous name in Doctor Who and in television. Now, I think he had done a couple of plays before this, but though this was his first novel. And honestly, nearly 30 years later, I think it is 30 years later, wow. I think this is the best thing Mark Gatiss has ever written. And in fact, it might be my overall favourite new adventure, because it's the only one I've actually reread in the last 10 to 15 years. And I still think it's as good as it was back then. It's just a really good claustrophobic horror story with a small English village being besieged by apparently ghosts. And it's about nostalgia and the inability to move on. And it's just a really, really good horror story. Really tremendous atmosphere. This has been adapted into a Big Finish audio. I have not heard it. I have heard that it's not as good as the book. And I kind of don't want to listen to it, because I do think the book is really, really, really good. It would be a shame to kind of besmirch the memory of it almost if the adaptation isn't that good. The next book in the series is Love and War, which is a quick return by Paul Cornell. Now, this is a significant one, as it features the temporary departure of Ace from the series and the arrival of a new companion in the form of the long-running Professor Bernice Summerfield. Now, this is another very good book from Paul Cornell. It's not my favourite of his, but it's a very interesting science fiction story with horror elements, and it's a very kind of traumatic exit for Ace, with the Doctor's manipulations having seriously disastrous consequences for her personally. It's a very good book. Again, it's not one of my absolute favourites, but it's a suitably traumatic exit for Ace that could have just stood without bringing her back, really. The next book in the series is the very controversial Transit, written by Ben Aronovich, who of course wrote Remembrance of the Daleks and Battlefield on television. Now, a lot of fans were looking forward to this, only to find themselves presented with something decidedly unexpected. This is a very controversial book. It's a very despised book. Some gratuitous language, gratuitous sex. Yeah, this does not feel very Doctor Who at all. This is basically like Warhead. This is like a sort of dystopian cyberpunk thing that isn't really very Doctor Who-y. Unlike Warhead, I don't like Transit. I found it boring, honestly. I got to the end of the book and I was like, what the hell was all that even about? You know, I mean, I liked Warhead. Whether it's a good Doctor Who story is open to debate, but it's a good book. It's a good thriller. I found Transit really, really boring. Just what the hell was all that about? Answers on a postcard. The next book in the series is The Highest Science, written by another new writer, and another new writer who has gone on to much fame in the Doctor Who community, Gareth Roberts, who of course has written several stories for the TV series. Now, The Highest Science is almost determinably retro. And again, probably something of a major relief for fans after Transit. This is just an old-fashioned adventure with its tongue firmly in its cheek. I think this has also been adapted by Big Finish. Now, to be honest, I wasn't a big fan of this. I'm still not. It was considerably more readable after Transit, but I didn't quite get the hype at the time. Honestly, I think Gareth Roberts was better suited to the Missing Adventures series that would come along later on. None of his new adventures really kind of hit the heights, though this is probably the best of his, with some fairly wacky stuff. The next book is The Pit, written by another new writer, Neil Penswick, who has also not done anything since. Yeah, I really have very little memory of The Pit. It was very boring, very strange. I can't even remember what the hell it was about. Yeah, I can see why he never came back. The next book in the series was Deceit, written by Peter Darvill Evans, who was actually the overall book editor for Virgin for the New Adventures. And this sees the reintroduction of Ace, albeit 3 years older and very much hardened. She's sort of become like a soldier or a space mercenary. It's all very weird. I'm not sure it was a very good idea. I mean, I can kind of understand them wanting to age her a bit, but it doesn't really feel very much like Ace, honestly. It feels like we've just kind of replaced her with a completely different character in many ways. And Deceit was not, again, it's not very Doctor Who-y. It's sort of like a sci-fi adventure thing, thriller, but I didn't find it particularly compelling. It's not awful, but it's not very good either. Lucifer Rising is the next book, and this kind of concludes the kind of, it's a sort of future history arc that began with Love and War, though it's a fairly loose arc, and you'd be forgiven for not even noticing it. This was written by Jim Mortimer and Andy Lane, both of whom would go on to write future stories in the series and in other novel ranges. This is another kind of sci-fi thing. It's a bit better than Deceit. I wasn't overly thrilled, honestly. Oh well. The next book in the series is called White Darkness, which was written by David A. McKinty, who's also gone on to write for various different novel ranges. This is sort of like a horror story set in Haiti, however you say it. And there's like zombies and German spies. It sounds good, you know. I mean, the setting is interesting, and it's got like the occult overtones and that. But I just found it a bit dull, honestly. The next book in the series is Shadowmind, which was written by Christopher Bulis, another new writer who has gone on to write other things again. This is basically just like a sci-fi story. I think there's like again, it's a long time since I've read these, and this wasn't one of the most memorable stories at the time. The nicest thing you can say about it is it was a bit of a traditional story and it doesn't frighten the horses, but it's not very memorable. Now, the next story was another novel by Nigel Robinson called Birthright. Now, this is actually a pretty good story. It's kind of written in chunks. Something happens to the TARDIS. Bernice is kind of stuck in the Victorian era, and the TARDIS is basically on the shores of the Thames, basically dead. We don't know where the Doctor is, and there's some kind of creature going around Victorian London killing people, or something like that. Now, I think this has been adapted, but actually not as a Doctor Who one. I think this was adapted by Big Finish solely for the Bernice Summerfield range. I think this was before they got the right to do... Oh, I don't know. Who knows? Seems a very strange decision to me to do that, but there you go. But yeah, this was a pretty solid book. This was probably the best since Love and War, actually. Again, the plot's quite original, but it's got a traditional feel to it that, unlike some of the new adventures, you actually feel like you're reading a Doctor Who book. I liked Birthright. It's pretty solid. The next book in the series is called Iceberg, and it's written by David Banks, better known, of course, as the Cyber Leader on TV in the 80s. And as you might expect from a book by David Banks, it's got the Cybermen in it. Iceberg, it's one of those books that kind of puts a different character to the forefront in the form of a character called Ruby. I think the Doctor's in it, but not very much. That being said, Iceberg is reasonably good. It's not one of the best books in the series, but it's a reasonably entertaining read, and it gets quite gripping in like the last half of the book, with the Cybermen really come out of the shadows and doing their thing. It's a solid read, especially if you like Cybermen. Now, the next book in the series kicks off another kind of arc, which is, I think it's like the alternate history arc or something like that. Though again, there's no kind of cover acknowledgement of that. The next book is called Blood Heat, and it's written by Jim Mortimer on his own for the first time. And it basically takes place in an alternate world where the Doctor was killed by the Silurians during the events of Doctor Who and the Silurians. So the third Doctor was killed, and the Silurians basically won and took over. And the Doctor and Company arrived to find themselves in this alternate history where the Earth is being kind of remade to suit the Silurians, and humanity is basically dying, and the last vestiges are struggling to try and overthrow it. It's got like the Brigadier, an alternate Brigadier, and Benton, and it's an interesting premise. I'm not sure the book really fully lives up to it, to be honest. I'm not sure the writing style really gels with me, but it's certainly an interesting idea, and it kicks off the idea that there is somebody or something manipulating time against the Doctor. The next book in the series is The Dimension Riders by new writer Daniel Blythe. I don't remember a single thing about The Dimension Riders. It's got a really cool cover with the Doctor playing chess with death or something by the look of it. I remember absolutely nothing about this book. Oh well. The next book in the series is The Left-Handed Hummingbird, which is the debut of Kate Orman, who has gone on to write lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of Doctor Who fiction since. Left-Handed Hummingbird is a pretty entertaining story. Orman has a kind of a distinctive style. It's also the first New Adventures written by a woman, and the first written by an Australian. There's strange things going on. Something in the Doctor's own past has changed, and some kind of godlike being from the history of South America has been unleashed, and strange things are happening. It's difficult to really exemplify the plot, but it's quite compelling. It's well written and it's interesting. Again, at this point, you could argue that we're getting very, very far away from Doctor Who on television, but it's a reasonably good thriller. The next book in the series is Conundrum, which is a really good book, a really fun book. Somebody gave the books their sense of humor back. It's written by Steve Lyons. And spoiler alert, it's basically the Doctor and Company are in this small English village where strange things are happening, including superheroes and a famous five-like gang of child investigators, and all very strange, somewhat cliched things. And it turns out that we're actually in the land of fiction from the Mind Robber. And Conundrum is a really, really fun and a really entertaining book, and a very Doctor Who-y book. Now, this alternate history cycle comes to an end with No Future, which is written by Paul Cornell again. Now, a lot of people don't seem to like No Future. I have to be honest, I really, really liked it. Again, I haven't read it for a long time, but I've read it several times, and I really enjoyed this one. It's a kind of a wacky 70s set thing. There's strange things going on with technology being introduced to the 70s that shouldn't really be there. Units in it, the Brig and Company, rather more familiar from the TV series than their versions in Blood Heat. And it's just got a great sense of humour to it. Now, again, spoiler alert, the villain who has been manipulating things since Blood Heat turns out to be the meddling monk, out for revenge on the Doctor for what he did to him in Dalek's Master Plan. I really like New Future, and I think that the cheeky gag where the unit have to storm the BBC during a live concert of Paul McCartney's band, and they have to knock out the band and kind of do a transmission themselves, is very funny. Just the line. Chap with wings there. 5 rounds rapid. That's so bad, but very funny. The next book in the series is Tragedy Day, which is written by Gareth Roberts again. Not the biggest fan of Roberts's New Adventures, This is quite an amusing one. There's some very wacky ideas. And at least, again, it feels like Doctor Who, albeit a very strange one. The next book in the series is Legacy, written by Gary Russell, which is basically a Peladon story. And sees the return of the Ice Warriors and Alpha Centauri and all of that sort of thing. If you like the Peladon stories, you'll probably quite like Legacy. I didn't mind it. I'm not big on the Peladon stories, to be honest with you, but this was a reasonably entertaining read. It's very readable. The next book in the series is Theatre of War by Justin Richards, who would go on to write many books, and I think he was like the editor of the BBC books range as well, at least for a while, wasn't he? And this has also been adapted, I think. I'm fairly mixed on Theatre of War, to be honest. I liked the first half more than the second half. The first half, which is kind of like a traditional base under siege horror with like mud people, monsters, things. That's more entertaining and more up my alley than the second half, which is a bit weird and convoluted and okay. But it's okay. The next book in the series is All Consuming Fire, which I think is the first solo one written by Andy Lane, who of course co-wrote Lucifer Rising with Jim Mortimer. And this is basically a kind of a crossover. It's that one we all know. Guess who's in it? Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. And this has been adapted into audio form, and I have heard the audio, and it's a pretty good adaptation. I think I might even prefer it to the book. Not that there's anything wrong with the book. It's a very entertaining story. It's Sherlock Holmes. You know, a large chunk of the book is written by Dr. Watson in the Conan Doyle style, and there's monsters and the Doctor, and yeah, it's a fun read. The next book in the series is Blood Harvest. Terrance Dicks is back for the first time since Exodus, and you know, it's Terrance Dicks. The guy knows how to write a book. This is basically a sort of a semi-sequel to State of Decay. Part of the book actually takes place on the State of Decay planet. Part of it takes place in 1920s Chicago. It's a very entertaining read. Vampires, gangsters, and you know, Terrance Dicks knows how to write. His stuff is always readable, even when it's bland, and this is not bland. This is a solid book. I don't think I like it as much as Exodus, but it's pretty good. Now, if there's one thing I do have to complain about, and I'm going to put in a little bit of a rant here, and I don't think it's Terrance Dicks' fault. I imagine this was requested by the editors of the New Adventures. I really, really, really dislike Romana basically being brought back and ending up on Gallifrey. I really, really hate this. And I really hate that later on they made her president, and that other things like Big Finish as stuck to that continuity, even though it's complete bollocks. To me, that is just a complete betrayal of the whole fucking character arc that she had in the TV series. It's just a complete betrayal of the character that started off as the stodgy academy graduate and ended up basically turning into a female version of the Doctor and flying off in time and space to help people. To just drag her back to the administrative borefest that is Gallifrey. It's a complete fucking betrayal of the character, and I fucking hate that. I hate it. I hate it. I'm sorry. Okay, as far as I'm concerned, she's still in fucking E-space. And anything that says otherwise is non-canonical. Okay, rant over. The next book in the series is Strange England, written by Simon Messingham. This is some kind of weird horror in a small town, small village. I don't really remember very much about it. It was readable enough, but it's not particularly interesting. The next book is First Frontier, written by David A. McKinty. This is set in the US in the 50s, and it has for the first encounter in the book series of the Master. Sorry, spoiler alert. And it's sort of like meant to be like a novel Doctor Who version of like a 50s sci-fi B movie sort of thing. Unfortunately, I find David A. McKinty a bit of a boring writer, to be honest with you. and his prose style doesn't really mix with what is what is supposed to be a kind of like a bit of like pulp B-movie sci-fi. Those two things don't really mix, in my opinion. I always found First Frontier a bit boring. St. Anthony's Fire is the next book, and it's the second book by none other than Mark Gatiss. Unfortunately, I found this a real letdown at the time. I was really looking forward to this, given how much I loved and still love Nightshade, and this was like him doing like an outer space adventure thing. It's just really, really unmemorable. There's kind of like a crazy religious cult who are quite entertaining. That's where the title comes from. They're basically just utter lunatics who exterminate everybody that doesn't follow their beliefs or something like that. It's just not very interesting. And it was a big letdown at the time. You know, from Nightshade, one of the best books in the series and a really cracking horror story, to just kind of a mediocre effort, in my opinion. Sorry, Mark. The next book in the series is Falls the Shadow by new writer Daniel O'Mahony. Now, this is some sort of weird, like, haunted house story with, like, sapphire and steel-esque stuff thrown in. I did not like it. I found it fairly dull. Despite some interesting ideas, it's overlong and... yeah, it wasn't my cup of tea at all. The next book in the series is Parasite by Jim Mortimer again. And I have to be honest, this to me gets my vote as one of the worst new adventures. I found this just not only not anything like Doctor Who, but just really incomprehensible bollocks. I think I managed to make it through the whole thing, and I still didn't have any idea what the hell it was supposed to be about when I'd finished. There is this, this tendency with some of the new adventures to just write something that doesn't feel like Doctor Who at all. This is just really boring. The next book in the series is Warlock, which is a follow-up from Andrew Cartmel, and is kind of a follow-up to Warhead. Now, this is probably the weakest of his three books, in my opinion, but again, it's still pretty good, simply because Cartmel's actually a really good writer. His prose style is just very accessible and readable, compared to some of the impenetrable styles of some of the other New Adventures writers in particular. So even if the story itself is not particularly Doctor Who-y, as none of the War trilogy really are, and it's probably the weakest of the three, but his prose style is just so immediate and readable and accessible that it's still entertaining and enjoyable to read. So yeah, no problem with Warlock. Good stuff. The next book in the series is Set Piece, which is by Kate Orman, and this marks the departure of Ace as a regular companion. I think she pops up once or twice, but this is really her final exit as a companion. Unfortunately, that's about all I can remember about it. I don't recall this being one of Orman's better books. It was kind of a bit dull. I like Ace's exit. I mean, I like that she gets what they do with her, that she basically gets her own time machine and goes off to have her own adventures, which is fine. That's a reasonable exit. It's better than, being blown up or something like that. But as a story, as a book, I found this very unmemorable. The next book in the series is Infinite Requiem, which is the second and final book by Daniel Blythe, who also wrote the Dimension Riders. And I remember even less about this than I do about the Dimension Riders. This was just real throwaway. I couldn't even tell you what the plot was. I'm looking at the cover, and I still couldn't tell you what the hell the plot was of this. It was just a real throwaway. The next book in the series is Sanctuary by David A. McKinty. This is basically a pure historical, the first time that they've done a pure historical in the series. and it's kind of a tragic love story for Bernice. Unfortunately, as I've said before, while I like the ideas, I do find McKinsey's style a bit leaden and dull, and it's not one of the most memorable books for me. The next book is Human Nature by Paul Cornell. And yes, it's that Human Nature. This, of course, was famously adapted into the TV series in Series 3 with David Tennant. To be honest, I prefer the book. I'm not really a fan of the TV version. I think the book version works better on various levels. There were various plot elements that were changed in the TV series that made more sense in the book. Now, this kind of follows on from Sanctuary because, like I said, that's a tragic love story where Bernice kind of loses this man that she falls in love with. He gets killed and she's grieving, and this is one of the reasons why the Doctor does what he does in terms of he turns himself human in a kind of a way to better understand what she's going through and humanity in general. And this to me makes way more sense than the TV version. The TV version just never made sense to me. You're being pursued by these aliens, so I know I'm going to turn myself human and completely lose my memory of what's going on and hide out in a school in 1913 or something, and put all these humans in terrible danger if these aliens find me. And especially given that these aliens only live about 30 days or something. So I'm going to do this instead of, just holding up in the TARDIS for a month. I just never understood that element of the TV show. And the book version just makes so much more sense because the Doctor doesn't know that someone is coming after him. It's a terrible coincidence, basically. He has no idea that he's being hunted by these things. Which makes him look a lot less fucking stupid and, what the hell are you doing? And also, I think the book works better simply because the Seventh Doctor, and particularly in book form, is so much more alien. And so there's a greater contrast between him and his human version. Whereas the Tennant Doctor was pretty fucking human to start with. So it's not really that much of a stretch. Anyway, this is as well written as you would expect from Paul Cornell, at least at this time. It's not my favourite of his books, but it's pretty good. I think it's better than the TV version. The next book in the series is Original Sin by Andy Lane. Now, this introduces two new companions to the series in the form of adjudicators Chris Swedge and Roz Forrester, who are basically sort of futuristic policemen. Original Sin is sort of like a sci-fi thriller with a returning villain, which is very silly in my opinion. I think this has also been adapted. I've never heard it. I didn't think that much to this one. Apparently it's quite popular. Some people really like it. It didn't really do that much for me. The new companions are okay, though I do feel that it's as difficult to really get invested in these companions that you've never seen before in books as it is the TV companions. This is okay, but and you have to sense at this point with a very alien Seventh Doctor who's increasingly divorced from the TV version and a bunch of book-only companions, you have to say that at this point the New Adventures was really becoming very, very unrecognisable as Doctor Who, in my opinion. The next book in the series is Sky Pirates, which is the debut of Dave Stone. Now, I have to be honest, I'm not a fan of Dave Stone, even though ostensibly I should be, because he's like a zany sci-fi comedic writer, and I like zany sci-fi comedic stuff. But his style just does not work for me at all, and I don't find it funny either. Sky Pirates was just, I just remember finding this unreadable and not funny and just what the fuck is this, basically. The next book in the series is Zampa by Gareth Roberts. I think this is his last New Adventures. This is, again, it's another kind of sci-fi humorous story, tongue-in-cheek, not to be taken seriously. It's more readable than Sky Pirates. Gareth Roberts' style is much more readable. But this was really, really, really unmemorable to the nth degree. I mean, like I said, I don't think he ever really fitted into the New Adventures as well as he did the Missing Adventures. But this is probably the absolute weakest of his books for the New Adventures because it's just so forgettable. I'd not only be hard-pressed to tell you the plot now, I think I probably would have been hard-pressed to tell you the plot back in the day when I just finished it. It's more readable than Sky Pirates, but it's really bland, really throwaway. The next book in the series is called Toy Soldiers, which is the first book by Paul Leonard, who I think went on to write a few more Missing Adventures and probably some for the BBC books range. This has quite an interesting premise. You've got like kids basically being there's like evil teddy bears or that are stealing kids from the 20th century and then sending them off to fight in a futuristic war or something like that. It's an interesting premise with some creepy ideas, though again I think the execution is not necessarily all that great, which is a shame because it is a kind of a cool idea, but I don't remember being that impressed with this one. The next book in the series is Head Games, which is written by Steve Lyons, and it's a direct sequel to Conundrum, which has the return of Doctor Who from the land of fiction, and he's out there causing chaos. Unfortunately, I was not a big fan of this. It does some interesting things with Mel, who's back in this story. But it's certainly nowhere near as good as Conundrum, in my opinion. It's very much a disappointing sequel in that regard. The next book is The Also People, which is the return of Ben Aronovich for the first time since the massively controversial Transit. This is less controversial. There's less of the extreme gratuity. It's basically just a sort of a pure sci-fi story set with Doctor Who. I seem to recall finding this considerably more readable than Transit. Just again, I didn't find it really very interesting. Again, it's kind of disappointing because I mean I love Aronovich's TV stories, but his book stories just never did anything for me at all. This one I think does have fans. I think there are some fans who really like this one, but it never really floated my boat. The next story in the series is Shakedown, which is by Terrance Dicks. And if you don't know, Shakedown, of course, was an independent video production in the early 90s that saw the return of the Sontarans and the Routons. And that forms part of this book, because obviously, as an independent production, the Doctor was not in the video version. This is kind of like part novelization, but with a bigger story around the events of that TV production, that video production, which does have the Doctor in it. Now that's a bit of a constraint, I think, which is probably why it's not one of the best books by Dicks in the series, but it's still pretty good. I mean, it's Terrance Dicks. He's very readable. It's not my favorite of his New Adventures. I prefer Blood Harvest. I prefer Exodus, but it's pretty readable. And in a run of books that were starting to get a bit starting to get a bit of a struggle to get through, honestly, this is something of a blessed relief. The next book in the series is Just War by Lance Parkin. I think this was another kind of pure historical. I don't really remember very much about this. It's set in World War II, I think. I really don't remember anything about this. It got a lot of praise at the time. I don't know whether it still does, but I just it it's just kind of meh to me, very throwaway and forgettable. The next book in the series is War Child, which is the final new adventure by Andrew Cartmel and the final in his War trilogy. Now, to me, this is probably the best of the three. Again, none of these really feel very much like Doctor Who, but they are good, solid sci-fi thrillers. And to me, that this was the most gripping of the trilogy. And again, I like Cartmel's style. His writing style is very accessible. So even though, again, it doesn't really feel much like Doctor Who necessarily, it's still very readable and enjoyable. And this was a pretty solid, quite gripping thriller. I enjoyed War Child. The next book in the series is Sleepy by Kate Orman, which is probably the most forgettable book she wrote. It's got something to do with telepathic powers, I think. It's not very interesting. I don't remember anything about it. I remember being distinctly unimpressed at the time. Just very boring, in my opinion. The next book in the series is Death and Diplomacy by Dave Stone, which is just as unreadable and just as unfunny as his first one. I'm sorry, I don't get this guy's style at all. This is significant only for the introduction of Jason Kane, who he and Bernice fall in love and have a relationship, and that leads into the next book. But as a book, this is just, I don't think I ever finished it, to be honest with you. It's just I just don't get this guy's style at all. The next book in the series, and the 50th book in the New Adventures, and something of a celebratory one, is Happy Endings, which is written by Paul Cornell, and it deals with Bernice's wedding, basically. And it's got a whole host of cameos and appearances, both from characters in the New Adventures, such as Ace, but also from more characters such as the Brigadier. And you've also got Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are in it as well, returning from All-Consuming Fire. I know a lot of people don't like this. I actually find it really fun, and I know it's been a while, but I've read it a couple of times, and I just thought this was a really funny, warm-hearted book. It's very silly. It's almost plotless, but it's very self-indulgent. But it's really entertaining and really fun. I rather like Happy Endings. I'm sorry. The next book in the series is God Engine, which is written by Craig Hinton. I think that's his debut, and it's got the Ice Warriors in it. I think it's set on Mars. Again, I remember very little about it. I don't think I liked it very much at all, even with Ice Warriors in it. I just found it fairly dull. The next book in the series is Christmas on a Rational Planet, which is the debut of Lawrence Miles, who's a fairly controversial figure in Doctor Who fandom, who's written a lot of books. And I'm afraid this is another writer whose style just not only leaves me cold, but utterly baffled. I find most of his books just completely fucking incomprehensible, to be honest with you. I'm not sure I ever made it all the way through Christmas on a Rational Planet. I have no idea what the fucking hell it was about, even when I was reading it. You know, I have to admit, at this point, I was starting to go off the New Adventures somewhat, because I just didn't recognize what the hell I was reading as being Doctor Who half the time. And this, I don't even recognize. Stuff like this, I don't even recognize as being a novel. I don't know what the fucking hell it's supposed to be about, to be honest. Just baffling and boring in equal measure. I'm sorry. The next book in the series is Return of the Living Dad, which is by Kate Orman, and a quick follow-up by Kate Orman. Now, very punning title, of course, Return of the Living Dead, Return of the Living Dead. This is about Bernice's dad, who was supposedly killed when she was a child. He turns out to be alive. He's on Earth, and he's got sort of like a shoulder in Face the Raven. He's got like a community of stranded aliens and that on Earth. I kind of liked this one. There's a bit of it's almost like happy endings in a way, in a little bit of a way, and it's kind of tongue in cheek, sort of mishmash. It's not as good as happy endings, but I quite liked this one. This kind of redeemed Kate Orman for me after Sleepy, which I just put me to sleep. This is quite entertaining. It's a little bit silly, but it's quite fun. The next book is The Death of Art by Simon Butcher Jones. And again, oh God, we're Christmas on a Rational Planet again. I found this unreadable and boring and baffling and impenetrable as to what the fuck it was about and what the hell's going on. And at this point I think they were really starting to turn into something that did not appeal to me, which I think a big part of it, something that kind of disappeared for a while and then kind of returned in vengeance with the 8th Doctor books. Honestly, this stuff just left me completely cold. The next book in the series is Damaged Goods by Russell T Davies. I've never heard of this guy. No, I don't think we ever heard from him again, did we, in Doctor Who? Some might say if only. Actually, just to shock you all, I actually thought Damaged Goods was really, really bloody good at the time. It has been adapted. I have heard the adaptation. I thought the adaptation was about 3/4 good and not so much, because the ending just kind of, when the chaos is going on, it just kind of descended into a lot of noise where you can't understand what the hell's supposed to be happening. But I actually thought the book was pretty solid. His prose style was kind of Cornelish mixed with a bit of Cartmel, so it was very readable, and it's quite a gripping story with some dark horror in a realistic setting. I don't know, I almost think this is better than anything he actually wrote on TV, but let's make him as a surprise. I actually liked this book. This is one of the, certainly of the later New Adventures, it was one of the better ones, frankly. Very readable. The next book in the series was So Vile a Sin, written by Ben Aronovich and Kate Orman. Now this one actually came out, I think, later on, because there was some kind of weird thing on it. It was supposed to be like the climax to some sort of loose arc that was going on in the book, so I couldn't for the life of me tell you what it was. And Ben Aronovich was supposed to be writing it, and I think he had like some kind of disaster, some kind of hard drive crash that wiped out 2/3 of the book, and he didn't have copies for some reason, and then he kind of got writer's block and couldn't redo it, so Kate Orman kind of stepped in to finish it off. It was all very strange. I didn't like this book. I don't know what the hell it's about. Again, at this point, it was just I was really I was having to force myself to buy the books. I think I was only kind of sticking with them because I knew it was coming to an end, so I might as well get them all, because BBC Books were taking over, so the New Adventures were coming to an end. But at this point, I really was losing interest to a massive degree, because I just, this didn't feel like Doctor Who to me, and all of the books like this were just really, really boring to me. This was not what I was into Doctor Who for. So yeah, it didn't do it for me, I'm afraid. The next book in the series is Bad Therapy by Matthew Jones, who went on to write The Satan Pit in Series 2, but has otherwise not really done very much Doctor Who related, I don't think. This is a bit of a weird one. There's some sort of like duplicates or something going on in the 50s or something. It's an interesting premise. It's not the most interesting of books. It's okay. I don't recall hating it, but it didn't exactly set my world on fire either. Oh, and Perry's in it for some reason. I don't know. The next book in the series is Eternity Weeps by Jim Mortimer. Now, I couldn't really get on board with most of Mortimer's stuff, and his last one, I think, was Parasite. I absolutely hated. So I was really not surprised I actually really quite liked this. It's sort of like an apocalypse thriller with some kind of deadly virus that's raging through, or the earth, or something like that. The treatment of Liz Shaw is a bit what the fuck, but this was actually a really quite gripping read at the time. I remember it's quite an exciting book, and quite scary, and yeah, this was certainly a big improvement on Parasite in my opinion. So very odd. The next book in the series is The Room with No Doors, which is the final book in the New Adventures by Kate Orman, though not her final book in Doctor Who fiction. I don't really remember very much about this. I think it's set in Japan, isn't it? Something like that. And I seem to remember it was okay. I seem to remember it was quite readable and well written and interesting. It was better than something like Sleepy, which didn't really do anything for me. But again, it's been a really long time. The penultimate book in the series is Lungbarrow by Mark Platt. This is set on Gallifrey, of course. It's famously the story that was originally going to be written for television as part of season 26. And John Nathan Turner put the kibosh on it because he thought it was revealing too much about the Doctor's origins and all this sort of thing. And they ended up doing Ghostlight instead. And I have to say, J&T was right. I know a lot of fans really like this, and a lot of fans were pushing for an adaptation of it, I think. Did it get one? I don't think so. I can't remember. I'm not sure. But it didn't do anything for me. As with Time's Crucible, I again, just the prose style and the overall plot was just really borderline incomprehensible and really difficult to follow and not that interesting anyway. J&T was right. I think that should probably go on his tombstone. J&T was right. And the final book in the series, which was written by Lance Parkin, is The Dying Days, which is the only New Adventures book to feature the 8th Doctor, because supposedly the TV movie takes place between Lungbarrow and this. This brings back Bernice. It's got the Brig in it, and it's basically an Ice Warrior invasion of the UK. Not Earth, the UK. And this is pretty fun. I mean, Lance Parkin's not one of my favourite writers. I find his style fairly workmanlike, and a number of his books were not really my cup of tea. But this was one of his best, in my opinion. I found this pretty entertaining and fun and very Doctor Who-y. And it's almost like, couldn't we have had the whole series be this much fun? You know? Especially lately when I was kind of getting bored and going off them. Couldn't they have all been this kind of entertaining to read? But generally speaking, The Dying Days is an entertaining book. The 8th Doctor, you know, I mean, it's difficult to do the 8th Doctor based solely on the TV movie, where half of it he doesn't even know who he is anyway. But they do a good job in bringing the character to the page. It's a fun book. And a good ending. My view of the New Adventures these days is, I don't know, a bit meh. You know, I mean, I was very into them at the time, at least to start with, and I loyally followed them, even though, like I said, towards the end, my enthusiasm started dying very much so. And I mean, I rarely read much Doctor Who prose fiction these days anyway. But I have fond memories of some of them. Particularly, the Cornells were great. Nightshade is probably my overall favourite of the series. I think they're still accessible. I think there's been some reprints, haven't there? And I think you can download PDFs from various sites and get them on your computer. I would recommend some of them with caveats. These days, they're more a sort of curiosity than what they were purported to be at the time, which was the official continuation of Doctor Who. Now they're sort of a relic from another time that many fans, especially modern fans, may not even be aware of. But they have their place in Doctor Who history, and of course not least because many of the names went on to bigger things with New Who. Not necessarily better things, but bigger things. Anyway, that's my wrap-up review of the New Adventures. I have been going for an hour now, making this the longest video I have ever done. So I think that's more than enough. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.